Chief Mason Reed snatched the rifle out of Emma Carter's hands, held it up in front of the entire team, and laughed. Not a quiet chuckle, a full chest-shaking laugh that bounced off every wall in that briefing room. He turned it over like it was a museum piece, like something you'd find rusting in a grandfather's barn, and said the words loud enough for everyone to hear. "What in the hell is this kid planning to do with this thing, hunt squirrels?" The room erupted. Grown men, decorated warriors doubled over. And Emma Carter, 19 years old, stood perfectly still and said absolutely nothing. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that briefing room, because what happened next changed everything. Those men thought they knew about skill, about pride, and about the most dangerous assumption a warrior can ever make. The morning Emma Carter arrived at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California, the Pacific was doing what it always does in early October, sitting flat and gray and indifferent, like it had seen too much to bother being beautiful anymore. The base had a particular kind of quiet that morning. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when serious men are preparing to do serious things and nobody feels the need to fill the air with words. Emma pulled her gear bag off the shuttle bus and stood for a moment on the pavement outside the operations building. She was 19 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, brown hair pulled back tight, no rank insignia beyond her temporary attachment credentials, no flashy equipment, no expensive tactical watch on her wrist, just a worn canvas bag over one shoulder and a long, hard-sided rifle case in her right hand that had seen better decades. She didn't look around like someone trying to prove she belonged. She didn't puff her chest or set her jaw or do any of the things young people do when they're trying to broadcast confidence they don't fully feel yet. She just looked at the building, took one slow breath, and walked toward the door. The man standing just inside that door was Chief Petty Officer Mason Reed. Mason Reed had been in the teams for 16 years. He had the kind of face that weather and time and too many difficult decisions had sculpted into something that no longer moved easily. He had deep-set eyes that cataloged everything in a room the moment he walked into it. He had the quiet authority of a man who had been the most dangerous person in hundreds of rooms across a dozen different countries and knew it without needing anyone to confirm it for him. And he was widely considered the finest long-range shooter in the entire command. Had been for years. Had the records to prove it. He looked at Emma when she walked through the door. He looked at the rifle case, and his first instinct, the instinct that came before any conscious thought, was to step aside and look past her for whoever was actually assigned to the Overwatch role on this operation. Because surely this was not it. Surely there had been some kind of administrative mix-up. Surely someone in personnel had clicked the wrong box. But there was no one behind her. Emma set her bag down, unfolded the paper with her orders, and handed it to the duty officer at the desk. The duty officer read it, looked up at her, looked back at the paper, and then nodded with the carefully neutral expression of a man who has learned never to show surprise at anything the Navy decides to do. "Carter," he said, "Overwatch element. You're with Team 7. "Yes, sir," Emma said. And that was when Mason Reed understood that the paper was not wrong. I didn't say anything immediately. He watched her check in. He watched her receive her briefing packet. He watched her carry her gear toward the staging area with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this enough times that the physical routine required no particular thought. And the whole time he was watching her, something was gathering in his chest that he would later be ashamed to name clearly, because it was not tactical concern and it was not professional skepticism. It was contempt. He had simply decided without knowing her, without speaking to her, without watching her shoot a single round, that she did not belong here. That whatever chain of events had placed a 19-year-old woman in temporary attachment with his team for a classified hostage rescue operation was a chain of events that had gone wrong somewhere. And the rifle case bothered him most of all. Not because he couldn't identify the profile, he could identify it immediately. I knew exactly what was inside that case before she ever opened it. He knew because his own father had owned one like it. Bolt action, old platform, pre-modern optics generation. The kind of rifle that men his father's age had considered the peak of precision, shooting technology at a time when the current generation of long-range weapon systems hadn't yet been dreamed into existence. It was not a bad rifle in the hands of a serious practitioner working within appropriate parameters. But this was not a range exercise with appropriate parameters. This was a live hostage rescue with variables that modern systems had been specifically engineered to handle. He waited until the full team was assembled in the briefing room for the mission overview before he said anything. He could have pulled Emma aside privately. He could have had a quiet professional conversation one-on-one about equipment standards and operational requirements. He was experienced enough to know that was the right way to handle a concern like this. He didn't do that. He waited until there were 14 men in the room, and then he reached over and picked up Emma's rifle case from where she'd set it beside her chair. And he unlatched it, and he lifted that bolt-action rifle out and held it up where everyone could see it. "Question for the group," he said. "Can anyone tell me what this is?" There was a pause. Someone said, "That's a hunting rifle." Someone else said something under their breath that got a short laugh from the men near him. And then Mason did the thing that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He looked at Emma directly with the rifle still raised, and he said it. "It's just a kid's gun." The laughter that followed was not cruel in the way that children can be cruel, where the goal is destruction. It was the laughter of men who are genuinely amused and who have not yet done the work of asking themselves why they are amused. It was thoughtless in the most precise meaning of that word. There was no thought in it, just reaction. Emma did not flinch. She did not flush. She did not clench her jaw or blink too fast or do any of the things that would tell you her emotions were threatening to surface. She looked at Mason with a perfectly level expression and waited for him to finish. When the room settled, she reached over, calmly took the rifle from his hands, latched the case, and set it back beside her chair. And then she turned her attention to the mission briefing materials. That was it. That was her entire response. Lieutenant Ryan Walker, standing at the front of the room, had watched all of this happen. Walker was 34 years old, a Naval Academy graduate who had passed BUD/S on his first attempt and had since accumulated a combat record that was both impressive and classified at a level most people in the building couldn't access. He was not an emotional man in the conventional sense. He processed situations rapidly and allocated his concern precisely without waste. What he felt watching Mason hold up that rifle was not anger exactly. It was something more like the faint tightening of an internal alarm system. He filed it. He would return to it later. The briefing itself was detailed and grim. An American aerospace engineer named Michael Dawson had been taken 11 days ago from a work site near the Arizona-Sonora border. The group holding him had demonstrated both patience and operational sophistication that suggested training beyond simple criminal enterprise. They were using the canyon terrain north of the border in a way that showed real knowledge of American surveillance patterns and response protocols. They had moved Dawson 3 times in 11 days, always just before a planned interdiction. Someone with genuine intelligence experience was advising them or had trained them or both. The current best information placed Dawson at an abandoned mining complex in a canyon system, roughly 60 kilometers from the nearest paved road. The complex had multiple structures overlapping sight lines from the surrounding ridge lines and only 3 viable approach routes for a ground assault team. All 3 of those routes had problems, not tactical problems, terrain problems, the kind that couldn't be wished away with planning. And this was where the overwatch position became critical. For an assault team to move through any of those 3 approaches, they needed eyes from elevation. Specifically, they needed eyes from an elevation that could see across the entire complex and down into the canyon throat simultaneously. The geometry of that requirement pointed to a single viable ridgeline position approximately 2,700 to 2,900 meters from the complex, depending on exactly where on that ridge you set up. Walker had assigned that position to Emma Carter, not because she was the first choice of anyone on the team. She was not a permanently assigned member. She was a temporary attachment whose presence had been arranged through channels that Walker hadn't fully traced yet, through a request that had come from someone with enough authority that it didn't invite questioning. But he had looked at her file. He had spent an hour with her file the night before the briefing, reading every document in it twice. And he had come away with a very specific feeling that he trusted completely, because it was not enthusiasm and it was not impression. It was the feeling of reading numbers that did not lie. The numbers in Emma Carter's file did not lie. After the formal briefing concluded and the team broke into small groups to work through equipment prep and route planning, Walker found himself watching Emma again. She wasn't socializing. She wasn't doing the informal networking that new attachments typically do when they're trying to establish themselves with an unfamiliar team. She had spread the mission materials across a corner of the briefing table and was going through them methodically. Not the tactical overlays, which is what everyone else was focused on. She was going through the meteorological data, the wind profiles for the canyon, the temperature gradients between 0600 and 1800 local time, the solar angle progression through the afternoon hours. Walker walked over. "You finding everything you need," he said. Emma looked up. "Yes, sir. Can I ask a question about the overwatch position?" "Go ahead." "The current designated position is on the southern spur of the ridge," she said, "approximately 2,700 meters from the main compound structure." "That's correct." If we're looking at an afternoon timeline for the assault phase, which the briefing suggests we're going to have significant canyon thermals developing after 1,300 hours. Hot air rising off the canyon floor, cold air moving across from the northern rim. Where that meets the southern spur, it creates a drift effect that won't show up on the standard wind charts because it's terrain-specific and time variable. She paused. It will push any round fired from that position left at extended range, progressively further left as the afternoon gets later and the thermal differential increases. Walker looked at her for a moment. "How much drift are we talking about?" "Enough to matter at anything beyond 2,000 meters, Emma said, "and the compound is at 2,700. You're recommending a different position. The northern spur is 300 meters further from the compound, but it's above the thermal layer, and the afternoon sun angle from the north puts the target face in full illumination, rather than partial shadow after 1,400 hours. Better visibility, cleaner ballistics, predictable conditions." Walker studied the topographical overlay she was pointing at. The northern spur position was further. Further meant harder, a harder shot, less at margin, more exposure for the shooter. "You understand that 3,000 meters is at the far edge of what this operation can justify as a reasonable shot geometry," Walker said. "Yes, sir. You're suggesting moving the overwatch position to make the shot harder on yourself in order to make the conditions more predictable." "Yes, sir." Walker looked at her for another long moment. She looked back at him without any particular expression. No anxiety, no performance. Just a person who had done the calculation and was presenting the result. "I'll think about it," Walker said. He did think about it. For approximately 90 minutes while the team continued prep, he sat with the weather data and the topographic information and worked through what she had described. He called a meteorologist at the Naval Air Station, who confirmed that the canyon thermal pattern Emma had described was not only plausible, but was essentially a guaranteed feature of that specific terrain type under those atmospheric conditions. He pulled the solar angle data and verified the illumination difference between the two positions. Everything she had said checked out. He found Mason Reed doing equipment inventory near the vehicles and pulled him aside. "Emma Carter's recommendation about the overwatch position," Walker said. "I'm going with it." Mason stopped what he was doing and looked at Walker. "She wants to move the overwatch position 300 meters further from the objective." "Correct. Because of canyon thermals." "Correct." Mason was quiet for a beat. "LT, the kid is overthinking this. We've run overwatch from southern spur positions in terrain like this dozens of times. Have you run it at 2,700 meters in a canyon that develops significant thermal differentials after early afternoon?" Mason didn't answer immediately. "She's right about the thermal pattern," Walker said. "I verified it. The science is solid." "The science might be solid," Mason said. "The question is whether a 19-year-old with a bolt gun she inherited from her father is the right person to be making 3,000-meter calls in a live hostage environment." Walker looked at him steadily. "She's right about the physics. The question is whether she can do what the physics enables. Those are two separate questions, and you're collapsing them into one." "I know what I saw in that briefing room," Mason said. "You saw a rifle case," Walker said. "That's what you saw." He walked away and left Mason standing there. That evening, while the team did final equipment checks and tried to get whatever sleep was available before the pre-dawn insertion, Emma sat alone with the mission map spread across a folding table. She was not reviewing the tactical overlays. She was not studying the compound layout or the enemy positions or the probable patrol patterns. She was studying the ground, the specific ground between her designated position on the northern spur and the compound 900 meters away. Every ridge, every thermal variation, every angle of incidence, every factor that could push a bullet 1 millimeter off its intended path at maximum range. She was not thinking about the enemy. She was thinking about everything between herself and them. One of the younger operators, a kid named Torres, who'd been with the teams for just under 2 years and hadn't yet developed the practiced indifference of the older hands, stopped near her table around 2100 hours and looked at what she was doing. "You nervous?" he said. Emma looked up. "About what specifically?" "About tomorrow, about the shot, about," he gestured vaguely, "about all of it." Emma considered the question seriously, which surprised him. He'd expected either dismissal or false bravado. He got neither. "I'm not nervous about the shot," she said. "I'm nervous about the things I haven't anticipated yet, the factors I don't know I'm missing." She paused. "That's the only thing that's ever worth being nervous about. The unknown unknowns." Torres looked at the maps she was studying. "What are you looking for right now?" "Anything my father would have seen that I haven't seen yet," Emma said. Torres didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He nodded and moved on. Emma looked back at the maps. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 7 years old. Not how to squeeze a trigger, how to think, how to see a landscape the way a bullet sees it, as a medium to be moved through rather than a backdrop to be ignored. He had spent her entire childhood laying a foundation of understanding so deep and so thorough that Emma sometimes couldn't tell where his thinking ended and her own began. She knew his voice better when she was looking through a scope than she knew it in memory, because that was where he had spoken to her most clearly, in the seconds before a shot, in the silence between breath and release. He had been dead for 3 years. She still heard him every time she settled in behind the glass. She went back to the maps. She had been at this for 6 hours. She would be at it for 6 more before she allowed herself any rest, not because she doubted her preparation, because she respected the distance between where she would be lying and where Michael Dawson was hoping somewhere in that mining complex that someone was coming for him. That respect was not something she could explain to the men who had laughed at her rifle. But she didn't need to explain it. Tomorrow the canyon would explain it for her. Around midnight, Walker stopped by the table. He didn't interrupt her. He just stood there for a moment, looking at the maps, at the careful notes she had made in the margins, at the wine calculation sheets she had filled by hand, at the small worn notebook beside her left elbow that had a name written on the cover in permanent marker. He didn't ask about the notebook. He said, "Get some rest before 0300. "Yes, sir." "Carter." He paused. "I moved the position. You were right about the thermals." Emma looked up at him. "Thank you, sir." Walker nodded and walked away. He did not tell Mason what he had said to her. He did not feel that was necessary. What was necessary was that in approximately 9 hours, a 19-year-old woman, whose name nobody in this building had known yesterday, would be lying alone on a ridge in the Arizona high desert with the lives of 12 men and 1 hostage, in a question nobody had ever been able to fully answer, sitting in the chamber of a rifle that an old man had left her as the only inheritance that mattered. Whether she was ready was no longer the question. The question was whether the team was ready to trust her. That answer would come in the canyon, and whatever it would come without warning, without ceremony, and without the luxury of being wrong. The insertion began at 03:17 hours. No moon, dry air that carried the smell of dust and something faintly mineral, the way high desert always smells before the heat comes back. The team moved in 2 elements. The assault group, 11 operators led by Walker, infiltrated by vehicle to a staging point 7 kilometers from the mining complex, then continued on foot through the canyon approach. Emma moved separately alone toward the northern spur position she and Walker had agreed on the night before. No spotter, no secondary. Just her pack, and the rifle case that had made grown men laugh 12 hours earlier. She had a radio. She had water for 18 hours. She had a small notebook in her left chest pocket with her father's handwriting in it. Ballistic tables he had compiled by hand over 30 years of shooting. Not software generated, not computer modeled. Written in pencil, corrected in pen, annotated in the margins in a script so small it was nearly illegible to anyone who hadn't grown up reading it. Emma could read it in the dark. The climb to the northern spur took 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was not a technical climb. It was just long and steep and relentless in the way that elevation gain always is in the dark, when you can't see how far you've come or how far you have to go, and the only measure of progress is the burning in your legs and the change in the air temperature as you rise. She moved without a light. She had walked the route in her mind so many times the night before that the terrain felt pre-memorized. Like a piece of music she'd been playing long enough that her hands knew it before her brain caught up. She reached the position at 0558 hours, 12 minutes ahead of her own schedule. She didn't celebrate that. She used those 12 minutes to settle in carefully, methodically, the way her father had taught her. Not fast and not slow, the right speed for the task. She built her position without drama, without rushing, oriented toward the compound, 900 meters below and across the canyon, and then she waited. She glassed the terrain between her and the objective. She noted the wind at her elevation, the temperature, the first faint light beginning to separate the ridgeline from the sky to the east. At 0631, Walker's voice came through the radio, low and controlled. Overwatch confirmed position. Overwatch confirmed. Northern spur, eyes on the objective. Copy that. Assault element is at the intermediate waypoint. We begin the final approach in 14 minutes. Copy. Wind is currently light and variable. Thermals haven't developed yet. Conditions are good. Good to hear. Keep the channel clear unless you have something. Understood. The radio went quiet. Emma kept her eye on the scope and began doing what she had spent the entire previous night preparing to do. She wasn't watching the compound. She was watching the space around the compound, the ground approaching it, the ridgeline above it on the far side, the narrow canyon throat to the east through which one of the 3 approach routes ran. She was watching the way light moved across surfaces, the way shadows fell and changed, the way stillness looks different from absolute stillness, the kind of stillness that only happens when someone is holding it deliberately. The assault team had been moving for 6 minutes when Emma saw the first thing that didn't fit. It was nothing dramatic. It was exactly the opposite of dramatic. It was a man standing on a rock formation at the eastern edge of the compound perimeter who appeared to be doing nothing. Standing, looking at the sky, arms at his sides, completely relaxed. It was such an ordinary posture that your eyes could slide right past it if you weren't specifically looking for the thing that was wrong with it. The thing that was wrong with it was that he had not moved in 4 minutes, not shifted weight, not looked at his phone, not scratched his face, not done any of the 1,000 micro movements that a human body makes automatically when it is simply standing and existing without particular purpose. He was not simply standing. He was covering an approach corridor. Emma watched him for another 30 seconds to confirm. Then she keyed the radio. Walker, Overwatch. Go ahead. I have a static observer at the eastern perimeter. He's holding position on the rock formation approximately 40 meters north of the canyon throat entrance. He's been stationary for 4+ minutes. His sight line covers your approach corridor. A pause on Walker's end, short but there. You're saying he's a lookout. I'm saying he's positioned exactly where you'd put a lookout if you knew which direction a team was coming from. Another pause, longer this time. Copy. We're holding at current position. Stand by. Emma kept her scope on the man on the rocks. She noted the exact angle of his head, the direction his face was pointing. She ran the geometry in her mind and felt something cold settle into the base of her stomach because the direction his face was pointing was not randomly chosen. He was oriented toward a specific segment of the approach corridor, the segment the assault team would enter in approximately 4 minutes if they continued on their current route. She keyed the radio again. Walker, I need to tell you something and I need you to listen carefully. I'm listening. His orientation is too precise. He's not watching generally. He's watching specifically. He knows the approach route. The silence on the radio lasted 5 full seconds. In tactical communication, 5 seconds is a very long time. Walker's voice came back, controlled, but with something underneath it that hadn't been there before. You're walking into an ambush. It was not a question. He was repeating what she had said to confirm it to the team around him. She could hear the shift in background audio, the sound of men who had been moving going still. That is my assessment, Emma said. Yes, sir. She heard Mason's voice in the background, tight and sharp. How does she know that from 3 kilometers away she's looking at a guy standing on a rock? Walker's voice lower now, directed at Mason rather than the radio, because she's been watching him for 4 minutes and he hasn't moved. Men stand still. Not like that, Emma said. She had kept her channel open. A man standing still because he's bored moves his weight every 30 to 90 seconds. A man standing still because he's watching a specific point for a specific thing doesn't move at all. There's a difference and it's visible at any distance if you know what you're looking for. Silence. Then Mason said something she couldn't fully make out. But she heard the word 19 in it. Walker's voice came back on the primary channel, clear and deliberate. All elements hold position. Overwatch. I need your full assessment. What are you seeing beyond the single observer? Emma had already been building the picture. She went through it methodically the way her father had taught her to report. Not what she thought, what she could see. Facts first, interpretation after. The observer on the eastern rocks covers the primary approach corridor. I have a second individual on the roof of the southern structure who has been moving in a pattern that isn't consistent with normal activity. He's pausing at regular intervals at specific points along the roofline. Those points correspond to sight lines down into all three approach corridors. He's checking fields of fire. She heard someone on the team say something short and profane. I have vehicle-sized heat distortions behind the northern structure that weren't there at first light. They've developed over the last 22 minutes. Either those vehicles arrived recently or their engines were recently started. Either way, something mobilized in the last half hour. That's 3 anomalies, Walker said. 4, Emma corrected. The main gate is open. It was closed when I first glassed the compound at 0631. It opened 19 minutes ago and no one has gone through it in either direction. The radio was quiet for 8 seconds. An open gate, Walker said slowly. An open gate in a forward-facing position with 3 covered approach corridors and a mobile element staged behind the northern structure, Emma said. That's not a gap in their security. That's an invitation. Another pause. Then Walker said very quietly, they want us to come in. Yes, sir. And then something happened that Emma had not expected that she would think about for years afterward because it revealed something about the gap between knowing and believing that no amount of preparation can fully bridge. She heard Mason Reed's voice come through the background audio on Walker's radio and his voice had changed. The dismissiveness was gone. What replaced it was not concession or apology. It was something more primal than that. It was the sound of a man who has been wrong about something important and has just understood that he was wrong, and the understanding is arriving at exactly the wrong moment. LT, Mason said, if she's right about the open gate, then they knew we were coming before we left Coronado. The implication of that landed on the channel like a stone dropped into still water. Expanding rings of consequence. If the enemy had intelligence about the operation before insertion, then the problem was not just tactical. It was something much worse. Walker's voice came back to Emma. Overwatch, what's your current read on the observer? Still stationary. Emma checked. Negative. He's moved. He's walking toward the eastern canyon throat. Direction. He's moving away from the compound, toward the approach corridor. He's not patrolling, he's positioning. She paused. He's going to a position where he can confirm visual contact with your element when you enter the corridor. The breath Walker took was audible through the radio. Copy, all elements we are redirecting. Alpha, take the secondary route. Bravo, hold current position and wait for my mark. It was the right call. It was also the call that cost them 11 minutes of movement time and put them into the window when the canyon thermals would begin developing. Emma noted that. She noted everything. She kept glassing, systematically working her scope in a pattern that covered the entire compound and the ground around it in overlapping arcs, and she felt the familiar compression of time that happens in situations like this. When the gap between what you know and what you need to know is narrowing faster than you can fill it. It was during the 4th arc of her systematic sweep that she found what she had been most afraid of finding. She almost passed over it. It registered as shadow geometry. Initially, the way a trained eye sometimes tags something as wrong before the conscious mind can articulate what wrong means. She went back. She adjusted her scope, micro-clicked, the magnification up, steadied her breathing, and looked again. There were men in the canyon walls. Not in the compound, not near the compound, in the rock itself, in firing positions that had been prepared in advance. She could see the geometry of cover and concealment in the rock formations. that only made sense if someone had carved those positions, deliberately placed them to cover specific corridors, which meant they had been placed before the SEAL team's approach routes were even finalized. Which meant whoever was directing the enemy force on the ground had anticipated not just the general direction of assault, but the specific tactical options available. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to breathe. She forced herself to continue the sweep rather than locking onto the positions she'd already found, because if there were prepared fighting positions in the canyon walls, there were more of them than the ones she could currently see. She found 3 more in the next 90 seconds. She keyed the radio. "Walker, Overwatch. I have a significant development. You need to stop moving. We're between positions right now." "I understand that. Stop anyway." Her voice was even, completely flat, because the flatness was necessary. Because if she let any of what she was feeling into her voice, Walker would hear it, and the team would hear it, and it would cost them the seconds they needed to think clearly. "I have prepared fighting positions in the canyon walls on both sides of the secondary approach route. Minimum 4 positions, confirmed possibly more. These were not improvised. They were built in advance." Complete silence on the channel. She kept talking because silence in a tactical environment is not always thought. Sometimes it's paralysis, and she could not afford for the team to be paralyzed right now. "The positions cover the secondary route from 2 elevations. Anyone moving through the corridor will be in overlapping fields of fire from the moment they enter the canyon throat until they reach the compound perimeter. That's approximately 400 meters of kill zone with no available cover." She paused. "The secondary route is not an alternative. It's the primary ambush position. They expected you to redirect to it." More silence. Then Walker said, and his voice was very, very quiet, "What about the tertiary route?" Emma had already been looking. She had started checking the tertiary route the moment she confirmed the 4th canyon wall position, because she needed to know if there was any way out of this before she finished telling Walker how deep in it they were. "Stand by," she said. She scanned the tertiary approach corridor. It was the longest route, the most exposed, the one that tactical doctrine identified as the least preferable option, which was, she understood now, exactly why it had received the least attention from whoever had designed this trap. She worked her scope along it for 90 seconds. She found one position, on the western rim elevated covering the midpoint of the tertiary corridor, not the entrance, not the exit, the middle, which told her the position had been placed to catch a force already committed to the route, not to deter entry. "Walker," she said, "go." The tertiary corridor has one confirmed position, western rim mid-corridor elevated. It's designed to catch you at the midpoint, not turn you back at the entrance. "1 position versus 4 on secondary," Walker said. "1 confirmed versus 4 confirmed. I may be missing others on both routes." She said it clearly because he needed to know the limits of what she could see. "But based on what I'm seeing, the tertiary is their lowest priority approach. It's bad, but it's not designed the way the others are. Can you neutralize the western rim position from your location?" "Yes." "If I take the tertiary route, how long do I have before the thermal layer becomes a significant factor on your end?" Emma looked at the sky. She looked at the ground temperature shimmer she could already see beginning to develop in the canyon bottom. She did the math in the precise mechanical way her father had drilled into her until it happened without effort. 42 minutes, she said. "After that, the thermals will be developed enough that I need to begin applying significant drift correction. My accuracy window at this range narrows after 42 minutes. 42 minutes to get through the tertiary approach and reach the compound. At your element's movement pace, that approach is approximately 38 minutes. Tight. Very." She heard him exhale. Then he said something to the team that she couldn't fully make out. She heard Mason's voice again, and this time it was different from anything she'd heard from him since she'd arrived at Coronado. The rough dismissiveness was completely gone. What was in its place was the voice of an experienced man doing rapid triage on a situation that had just become substantially more dangerous than the one he'd prepared for. "She right about the 42 minutes, Mason asked Walker. "She was right about the thermals yesterday when nobody believed her," Walker said. "Yeah, I think she's right about 42 minutes. A brief pause. Then Mason, then we move. Now." And that was the moment Emma understood something about Mason Reed that changed how she thought about him, not immediately and not completely, but in the way that understanding sometimes begins as a small shift that you only recognize as significant later. He was not a man who doubled down on being wrong when lives depended on being right. Whatever his failings were, that was not one of them. The assault element began moving. Emma tracked their progress by radio and by visual confirmation when their position crossed areas within her sightline. She kept sweeping the terrain simultaneously, looking for the things she hadn't found yet, looking for the unknown unknowns she had told Torres about the night before. The things that weren't in any briefing, that no satellite had captured, that no intelligence analyst had identified. Because they were the kind of things that only revealed themselves to someone who was physically present and paying attention to what the ground was actually telling you, rather than what the map said it should be telling you. She found it at the 31-minute mark. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at, and that delay bothered her afterward, the seconds it cost. What she saw first was movement on the far ridgeline, small, methodical, someone moving very slowly and very deliberately on the ridge above and behind the compound, in a position that was not in any of the mission briefing materials as a potential enemy location. She tracked the movement. She saw the rifle first, the profile of it. Long barrel elevated at an angle that told her exactly what kind of shooting position this person was establishing. Then she saw the man behind it settling into a prepared hide on the ridgeline that had clearly been built and used before. This was not a fighter who had moved to that position in response to the SEAL team's presence. This was a sniper who had been there before the team ever arrived, covering the tertiary approach. From a position that Emma could not see from her current angle, without moving, which meant she had not confirmed it earlier because it was not visible from the primary overwatch position. It was visible only because the assault team's movement through the tertiary corridor had caused this sniper to shift slightly, and that shift had taken him from perfect concealment into the 90-degree window where Emma could now see him against the rock background, 1 second of exposure, maybe less. But Emma had been looking. She keyed the radio and kept her voice exactly as controlled as it had been at every other point in the last 3 hours because the team was 31 minutes into a 38-minute movement, and she was not going to put panic into the radio channel with 7 minutes left on the clock. Walker, Overwatch. I have a sniper on the far ridge line, elevated position above and behind the compound. He has a direct sight line into the tertiary approach corridor, approximately 80 meters ahead of your current position. A pause. Emma, Walker said, and it was the first time he had used her name directly rather than Overwatch. She noticed. Can you see him clearly? I have a partial visual. He's in a prepared hide. He shifted approximately 2 seconds ago and gave me a brief window. He's back in cover now, but I have his position marked. Can you take him? Emma checked the distance. She checked the wind. She checked the thermal shimmer that was now beginning to develop in earnest. She was 39 minutes into her 42-minute window. The ballistics were becoming more complex by the minute. The target was in partial cover. The angle was difficult. Not from current position, she said. I need to move approximately 40 meters north along the spur to open the angle. How long to move and re-establish? 4 minutes. That's 4 minutes. Your team is not moving, Mason said from somewhere behind Walker. That's 4 minutes or your team walks into a prepared sniper position with no overwatch, Emma said. Not sharp, not defensive, just precise. Your choice, sir. The radio was silent for 3 seconds. Move, Walker said. We hold. Emma moved. She did it correctly. She did it the way her father had shown her, which was slowly enough to avoid creating movement signatures and quickly enough to matter. She picked up her position, relocated 40 meters north along the spur, and rebuilt without rushing. She settled in. She found the ridgeline position again. She found the sniper's hide in the rock. She waited. The sniper shifted again, adjusting his position in response to something, perhaps sound, perhaps radio, perhaps the simple instinct of an experienced shooter who knew his hide had been compromised without knowing precisely how. The shift was small, but it was enough. Emma had the angle now. She took 3 slow breaths. Her father's voice was there the way it always was in the final seconds before the shot. Not words exactly, more like a presence, a steadying weight on the inside of her chest that she had carried since she was 7 years old, and that she knew she would carry for the rest of her life because it was the only piece of him left that was still warm. She fired. The sound of the shot rolled across the canyon, and by the time it arrived at the far ridgeline, the man in the hide was already still. Emma was back on the radio before the echo finished. "Target neutralized. Western Rim sniper is down. Done. Path is clear. You have approximately 2 minutes before I expect secondary response from the compound." "Moving," Walker said. His voice was stripped of everything except information. "All elements push forward. Now." The assault team surged. Emma swept back to the compound tracking, looking for the response she had predicted. She found it in 90 seconds. Two fighters emerging from the northern structure moving fast toward the elevated position on the southern roofline, which told her the compound had heard the shot and was repositioning. She noted their movement. She tracked their routes. She mapped in real time what the response pattern was telling her about where the compound's command element was located, because a defensive response always reveals something about the decision-making center. And what this response was telling her was that the command element was in the main structure. The largest building, the one the briefing had identified as the most likely location for the hostage, but had not confirmed. Now she was more confident. She keyed the radio again. "Walker, compound response is moving toward the southern roofline. Their command element is in the main structure. I believe that's also where Dawson is being held. The response pattern is consistent with protecting a high-value asset in that specific location." "Copy that," Walker said. "We're 60 seconds from the perimeter." Emma counted. She swept. She tracked. She found two more fighters repositioning in ways that told her the compound's security force was disorganized, in the way that organizations become disorganized when their plan is not going the way it was supposed to go. The trap had been set. The team had not walked into it. And now the people who had set it were making decisions under pressure without a clear picture of what was happening outside their walls. That was good. Chaos in the enemy position was good, but chaos was also unpredictable. And unpredictable meant her window for every shot was narrowing. Because a man acting according to a plan is visible from a distance. A man acting out of desperation can appear from anywhere at any moment, and the gap between appearing and acting is always shorter than you want it to be. She heard the first gunfire from below at 0849 hours. The assault had begun. She kept her eye in the scope and her hand on the rifle, and she kept watching, and the thermals were fully developed now, and she was making corrections that most shooters would have called impossible, and she was making them calmly, mathematically, the way she had been taught to do since before she was old enough to understand what the corrections were actually correcting for. And somewhere in the compound below, in a room she couldn't see, Michael Dawson heard the first shots and probably understood for the first time that the thing he had been trying to believe was still possible was actually happening. People were coming. Whether they would reach him was still in this moment an open question. But someone on a ridge 3 kilometers away with a rifle that had made men laugh was doing everything in her power to make sure the answer was yes. The gunfire that erupted at 0849 hours was not the clean, controlled exchange that training scenarios prepare you for. It was layered, overlapping, coming from multiple directions inside the compound simultaneously, which told Emma in the first 4 seconds of listening that the assault team had not achieved surprise the way Walker had hoped. They had achieved contact. That was different. Contact means the enemy knew exactly where you were the moment you came through the perimeter, and they had people positioned to engage you before you could establish momentum. She was already scanning when Mason's voice hit the radio. "Taking fire from the southern structure, 2 positions, upper and lower window. Alpha element is pinned at the northeast corner of the main building." Walker's voice sharp and immediate. "Bravo, push left. Get eyes on the roofline. Roofline has a shooter." Torres cutting his voice higher than usual, the way voices get when adrenaline outpaces training, for just a moment before training reasserts itself. "He's got the courtyard covered. We can't move through the open ground." Emma found the roofline shooter in her scope before Torres finished the sentence. He was positioned behind a low parapet on the southern structure's roof, elevated enough to have a clear angle down into the courtyard. The assault team needed to cross to reach the main building where Dawson was being held. He was disciplined, not exposing himself unnecessarily, moving only to acquire targets, then dropping back behind cover. She keyed the radio. "Overwatch has the roofline shooter. He's behind the southern parapet, center right. He's rotating. You'll have a 2-second exposure window when he comes up to engage." Can you take him? Walker asked. The thermal layer was fully developed now. She was running corrections in real time. Wind had shifted 6 degrees in the last 4 minutes. The parapet was partially obstructing the shot angle. The target was not stationary. The distance was just over 2,800 meters to the southern roofline. Affirm, Emma said. Stand by. She controlled her breathing. She let the world outside her scope become irrelevant. The radio chatter, the gunfire echoing up from the canyon below, the wind moving across the spur above her, all of it went to the background. Not because she stopped hearing it, because she had trained herself to hear it without letting it enter the place where the calculation lived. Her father's voice, the shot doesn't care what's happening around you. The shot not only cares what's happening between you and it. The roofline shooter came up. Emma fired. The shooter dropped and did not come back up. Roofline is clear, she said. Moving, Walker said immediately, and she heard the scramble of boots on hard ground as elements of the assault team pushed across the courtyard. That was 0851 hours. What happened in the next 4 minutes was the kind of controlled violence that only looks orderly from a distance. From Emma's position, she could see the assault team moving through the compound in the way water moves through a complex terrain, finding the paths of least resistance, reshaping their movement in real time as the environment pushed back. She was tracking 6 separate threats simultaneously through her scope, marking positions, reporting on the radio, making the micro-calculations that kept the picture accurate. Then at 0855 hours, everything changed. Mason's voice came through the radio, and it was not controlled. We have a problem. South building basement access. There are more of them. A lot more. This wasn't in the intelligence. Walker, how many? I don't know. We're hearing movement below us. Equipment. Voices. This wasn't a small team. LT, I think we walked into something bigger than a hostage hold. Emma was already moving her scope to the southern structure. She couldn't see below ground, but she could see the surface indicators of what was happening beneath it. A ventilation exhaust on the south face of the building that had been releasing heat steadily since she first observed the compound was now releasing significantly more. The thermal output had increased. More bodies, more equipment running, more heat. Walker, she said, the southern structure has active heat output consistent with a significantly larger force than the briefing estimated. I'm reading thermal signatures through the ventilation. This is not a standard hold position. What are you saying? Walker said. I'm saying the compound may be a staging facility, not just a holding site. The force you're engaging on the surface is not the full element. A 3-second silence that felt much longer. Then Mason, we're between an active engagement above ground and an unknown force below ground, and we don't have a clear route to Dawson. Main structure, Walker said. Stay on the main structure. That's where Dawson is. We don't engage below ground unless we have to. We get Dawson and we get out. And if they come up behind us, Torres said, then Overwatch watches our back, Walker said. Emma said, copy that. I have your 6. She meant it with everything she had. She also knew that watching the back of a team that was fighting its way through a compound while simultaneously monitoring an unknown force below ground and managing thermal correction at nearly 3 kilometers was operating at the absolute edge of what one person could maintain. But she did not say that. She said copy, and she meant it, and she got back to work. The assault team reached the main structure at 9:01 hours, 12 minutes into the firefight. She heard Walker's voice announce the breach. She heard the sharp sequential sounds of the team moving through the interior room to room. She was covering the exterior, watching for anyone attempting to flank the building, watching the approaches, watching the southern structure for any sign of the force Mason had heard below. What she saw at 0903 hours stopped her breathing for exactly 2 seconds. 3 fighters emerged from a secondary exit on the northern face of the compound, a door that was not on any of the briefing materials, not on any of the satellite imagery, because it was a door that had been cut through the original structure after the compound was built and was invisible to overhead surveillance unless you were specifically looking for it. They moved fast. 2 of them were carrying what Emma recognized by profile and movement as crew-served weapons. The third was directing them toward a position at the northern wall that would give them an angle into the courtyard where several members of the assault team had staged. Emma processed all of this in approximately 1.5 seconds. She keyed the radio. Walker, 3 fighters exiting north face secondary door. 2 crew served weapons. They're setting up at the north wall. Courtyard element is their target. Engage, Walker said without hesitation. Emma was already settled. First shot the man carrying the crew-served weapon on the left. He dropped. The other fighter with a crew-served weapon spun, trying to identify the incoming fire. He turned toward the wrong direction, entirely looking toward the compound interior rather than toward the ridgeline. The third fighter, the director, started running. Emma cycled the bolt. The smooth mechanical action of it was something she had performed 10,000 times. It was automatic in the truest sense of that word. Her hands did it while her eyes stayed in the scope. Second shot, the running fighter went down before he reached cover. Third shot, the remaining crew-served fighter, now kneeling and still looking the wrong direction, was neutralized. All 3 targets were down in 11 seconds. Courtyard is clear, Emma said. North wall threat is neutralized. She heard someone on the team say something she couldn't make out, but she recognized the sound of it. The sound of men who have just been told they are not going to die in the next 30 seconds, and the very specific kind of short, involuntary exhale that produces. Adur 906, Walker's voice came through clear and tight with something close to controlled relief. We have Dawson. He's alive. He's ambulatory. We're moving to extraction. And that was when the mission, which had already been harder and stranger and more dangerous than anyone had planned for, became something else entirely. Because Emma heard a sound that was not on the radio, a sound that came through the air carried up the canyon by the same thermal she had been correcting for all morning. A distant mechanical thump that she recognized before her conscious mind finished the process of identification. Rotary aircraft, coming from the south. She swung her scope south and found them almost immediately. 2 helicopters, not U.S. military profile, not rescue, not extraction. Walker, she said, I have inbound rotary aircraft from the south. 2 aircraft, non-U.S. profile. They are not our extraction element. They are approaching from the border. ETA to compound approximately 7 minutes. The radio went completely silent for 4 seconds. Then Walker said, say again. 2 inbound helicopters, southern approach, 7 minutes out. They are not ours. Another silence. Shorter this time because there was no time for long silences anymore. Reinforcements, Mason said. It was not a question. That's my assessment, Emma said. Walker's voice shifted to the specific register of a commander compressing a decision tree under maximum time pressure. What's our extraction window? Extraction bird is 12 minutes out, Torres said from somewhere inside the main structure. We have 7 minutes before those aircraft arrive and 12 minutes before our bird gets here, Mason said. That's a 5-minute gap. We hold the compound for 5 minutes, Walker said. With Dawson, Mason said. With Dawson. Get him into the interior. Keep him away from exterior walls and windows. Overwatch. I need those aircraft tracked at all times. Can you tell me when they're going to reach weapons range? Emma was already calculating. The aircraft profile, the speed, the approach vector. Affirm, based on their current profile and approach speed, they reach potential weapons range at approximately 5 minutes out. I'll give you a call at 4 minutes. Copy. What about the underground element they still haven't surfaced? They know you have Dawson, Emma said. They're waiting for the aircraft. The helicopters are the extraction plan for the fighters already here, and they'll use that window to push you out of the main structure. She's right, Mason said, and he said it without hesitation, without the qualifier of doubt that had been attached to everything he'd said about Emma in the past 14 hours. He said it as simple tactical concurrence, one professional to another. They're going to coordinate the surface push with the aircraft arrival. That's the play. Walker, then we deny them the surface push. All elements collapse to the main structure. Interior defensive positions. Nobody goes outside until our bird is overhead. Emma heard the team moving. She tracked the compound exterior, watching for any sign of the underground element beginning to surface. She found it at 0912 hours. A hatch she had not seen before set into the hard-packed ground of the western courtyard, pushed open from below. Walker, western courtyard, underground element is surfacing. I have a hatch opening. How many? Unknown, stand by. She watched the hatch. One fighter emerged, then a second, then a third. They were moving fast, clearly operating on a timeline, and the timeline was the aircraft. They needed to push the team out of the main structure and into the open courtyard before the helicopters arrived, so the approaching aircraft could provide fire support against a team in the open rather than inside a structure. A fourth fighter emerged from the hatch. A fifth. Walker, I have 5 confirmed, and the hatch is still open. Can you hold the hatch? Emma understood what he was asking. He was asking if she could make a position at nearly 3 kilometers unusable by a force trying to emerge from it. She thought about the angle, the thermal correction, the wind. She thought about the fact that the hatch was approximately 60 centimeters in diameter, and the fighters emerging from it were doing so one at a time. I can make it uncomfortable, she said. That's all I need, Walker said. Make it uncomfortable. She fired at the fighter moving away from the hatch toward the main structure. He went down. The fighters near the hatch scattered. 2 went back into the hatch. The others pressed against the eastern courtyard wall, which put them out of Emma's angle but also out of the angle from which they could threaten the main structure. You have 3 fighters at the eastern wall, Emma said. They're in cover. I don't have the angle, but they can't reach you without crossing the courtyard. Copy. They're neutralized for our purposes. What are the aircraft doing? 4 minutes 30 seconds to weapons range, Emma said. They've maintained approach speed. They know you're in the main structure. I think they're going to try to put fire on the structure itself before they land. Armed, Walker said. Unknown. I cannot confirm weapons load at this distance, but the approach profile is consistent with a weapons platform rather than a pure transport. If they're armed, we can't stay in the structure, Torres said, and his voice had moved past the earlier adrenaline-elevated register into something colder. The place where real fear lives, not the sharp, bright fear of immediate contact, but the slow, heavy fear of a situation that is getting narrower from every direction simultaneously. Walker said, options. Mason said, we need an overwatch shot on those aircraft. If they're armed and we're inside a structure, we are sitting in a box. Overwatch cannot engage aircraft, Emma said. I don't have an effective platform for a moving aerial target at this distance. She paused, and the pause was only as long as it needed to be because she had already been thinking about the actual problem while Mason was identifying the wrong solution. But I may have something else. Give me 30 seconds. She moved her scope. She had been tracking the 2 aircraft on approach. She had been watching their flight path. And in watching their flight path, she had noticed something. They were following the canyon, not flying over it, following it, threading through the canyon terrain on a low-altitude approach, which was tactically smart because it kept them out of radar coverage, but which also meant their flight path was fixed by the terrain. They could not deviate significantly without gaining altitude and exposing themselves. And at the point where the canyon made its primary turn, approximately 2,200 meters south of the compound, the lead aircraft would be at its lowest altitude and its slowest speed. Emma was on the northern spur. The angle from the northern spur to that canyon turn point was 31 degrees to the south and below her current position. She was not going to shoot the aircraft. She was going to shoot the pilot. Walker, she said, lead aircraft, canyon turn 2,200 meters south. When they make that turn, the pilot is going to be at his lowest speed and tightest angle. He'll be leaning the aircraft into the turn. That puts the cockpit at a geometry I can work with. Silence on the radio that lasted longer than anything else in the morning. Then Walker said very carefully, Emma, that is a moving aerial target at 2,200 meters. Yes, sir. In a canyon turn. Yes, sir. With thermal correction. Yes, sir. He stopped. And she could feel, even through the radio silence, the weight of what he was actually doing in those seconds. He was not calculating the probability of the shot. He was calculating something else. He was calculating the cost of not taking it. Mason's voice came through, and it was quiet in a way she had not heard from him before. Not the quiet of dismissal. The quiet of a man who has had something fundamental about his understanding of another person revised in the space of a single morning. LTA, Mason said, give her the call. Walker said, can you make the shot? The thermals were pulling left. The wind at her elevation had shifted another 4 degrees in the last 6 minutes. The target would be moving at approximately 90 knots in a bank turn at a canyon point she could see, but that the pilot could not see her from. She would have one window, maybe 2 seconds, maybe less. Her father had told her once when she was 15 years old and had just missed a shot she should have made. Emma, the only thing standing between you and that target was everything you hadn't learned yet. Learn it, then the distance disappears. She had been learning for 19 years. She thought about Michael Dawson, who was alive right now because the team had reached him, and who would stay alive or not based on whether those aircraft reached the compound. She thought about 12 men whose names she now knew, whose faces she had memorized in the briefing room, who were inside a structure waiting for her answer. She thought about her father's rifle, worn and unremarkable and capable of things that had made grown men laugh. She said yes, one word. Walker said, "Trust the overwatch." The radio went silent. Emma watched the two aircraft through her scope. She tracked their progress down the canyon. She calculated the turn point. She watched the lead aircraft begin to bank as the canyon curved. She saw the geometry change exactly as she had predicted. The cockpit swinging through the arc. The pilot focused on the terrain in front of him. She took one breath in. She let half of it out. She held. The aircraft reached the midpoint of the turn. She fired. The lead aircraft lurched. Not a dramatic explosion, not a cinematic fireball. It yawed hard to the left and descended rapidly and uncontrolled and struck the canyon wall below the turn point. The impact was visible from Emma's position as a change in the canyon's ambient light and a rising column of smoke. The second aircraft broke off. It pulled up hard, abandoning its approach, and banked east away from the canyon, gaining altitude as fast as it could. It did not return. The radio was silent for 6 seconds. Then Mason Reed's 16-year veteran of naval special warfare, a man who had been in more tight situations than he could count, and who had made the mistake of laughing that morning, said something over the radio channel that every person on the team heard. He said, "My God," not as profanity, not as expression, as the pure involuntary response of a man who has just witnessed something that has temporarily exceeded his ability to categorize it within his existing framework of what is possible. Walker's voice came back 4 seconds later, completely level, completely operational, because Walker was that kind of man. "Overwatch, extraction bird is 9 minutes out. What do you have on the compound exterior?" Emma had already moved her scope back to the compound. She was scanning, processing, cataloging. The 3 fighters at the eastern wall had not moved during the aircraft engagement. They were still in cover. The hatch in the western courtyard had been pulled closed from below. The compound interior was producing audio she could not directly access but could interpret through the radio traffic from the team. "Eastern wall fighters are still stationary," she said. "Underground element has pulled back below. No movement from the south gate. You have a clean exterior for the next several minutes. But I want you to understand that the situation below ground is unresolved. They still have people in that basement. They're going to come up again when they figure out what happened to the aircraft." 9 minutes, Walker said. "We just need 9 minutes. Emma said, "I'll give you 9 minutes. And she meant that with everything she was, in the same way she had meant every single thing she had said since she arrived at the northern spur position before dawn that morning. Without drama, without decoration, the way her father had taught her that real commitment sounds, not loud, not insistent, just certain. The next 9 minutes were the kind of time that stretches and compresses simultaneously, where each second feels individually distinct, but the aggregate passes faster than you expect, because every second is completely full of something that requires your full attention. Emma covered the compound exterior with the systematic discipline that had been built into her over a decade of training. She reported movement when she found it. She engaged threats when Walker called for it. She tracked the extraction helicopter on the radio as its ETA counted down. At the 6-minute mark, the western courtyard hatch opened again. 2 fighters emerged. Emma engaged the first before he was fully clear of the hatch. The second retreated. The hatch closed. At the 4-minute mark, 2 fighters came over the south gate wall and attempted to approach the main structure from the outside. Emma engaged one. The other made it back over the wall before she could cycle a follow-up shot. She reported his likely position to Walker. At the 2-minute mark, Mason's voice came through. "We're at the extraction point. Dawson is with us. All elements accounted for." Emma felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully realized she was holding. Not all the way. Not yet. The helicopter wasn't down yet. The team wasn't on it yet. But the thing that had been coiled tight at the center of her since 03:17 hours that morning eased one turn. "Extraction bird is 90 seconds out," Torres said. "I have visual." The next 90 seconds produced one more engagement when a fighter appeared on the south gate trying to get a clear angle on the extraction point. Emma put him down at 850 meters with a thermal correction that she did not think about consciously. She made the calculation and the correction and the shot in the same continuous fluid process. The way long practice collapses the gap between problem and solution until they feel like one thing. She heard the helicopter arrive. She heard the team loading. She heard Walker's voice doing the count. Alpha on Bravo, on all elements, on Dawson is on, we are lifting. She kept her scope on the compound until the sound of the helicopter faded enough that she could tell it had gained sufficient altitude and distance to be beyond any threat the compound could produce. She kept watching for 4 more minutes after that because that was the right thing to do. Because proper overwatch doesn't end when you feel like it's over. It ends when the asset is genuinely secure. At 0938 hours, she received the call. Walker's voice, steady, careful. Overwatch, asset is secure, extraction is clean. You are released from position. Emma lowered her eye from the scope. She sat back on her heels on the rock of the northern spur in the full heat of the Arizona morning, and for the first time in more than 3.5 hours, she allowed herself to be aware of how her body felt. The ache in her shoulders from the sustained position, the dryness in her throat, the way her hands steady through everything were now making the very small, very private tremble that hands sometimes make after they have been required to be perfectly still for too long. She looked at the rifle across her knees. She looked at her father's name on the notebook in her chest pocket. She did not say anything out loud. There was nothing to say out loud. What she felt was too particular and too interior for spoken language. It was the feeling of having been tested at the absolute limit of her capability and having found that the limit was further than the test. It was relief and exhaustion and something that was not quite pride because it was too quiet for pride. It was more like recognition. The feeling of understanding with your whole body rather than just your mind. That the years of preparation were real. That the distance her father had been trying to close for her across all those years of teaching was actually closed. She packed her gear methodically. She broke down her position in the correct sequence. She shouldered her pack and her rifle case and began the 2-hour descent from the northern spur. She walked alone, as she had climbed, but she walked differently than she had climbed. She wasn't entirely sure she could articulate the difference. Something in her gait, maybe. Something in the way she held her head. The mountain felt like ground she owned now in some way she hadn't on the way up. Not because she had conquered it, but because she had done what she came here to do on it, and that changes your relationship with a place in a way that is permanent and quiet and entirely your own. She reached the valley floor at 1141 hours. The transport vehicle was waiting. The driver, a young Navy petty officer she hadn't met before, got out to help with her gear. He looked at the rifle case. He looked at her. He looked at the dust on her clothes and the way she moved and whatever it was about a person's bearing that tells you without knowing anything specific that this person has been somewhere serious and come back from it intact. He didn't ask any questions. He just took the rifle case gently like it was something valuable and put it in the vehicle. Emma got in. She closed her eyes. She was asleep before they left the canyon. She was still asleep when the transport vehicle reached the forward operating base at 1347 hours. The driver, the young petty officer who had loaded her rifle case like it was something valuable, did not wake her immediately. He sat in the parked vehicle for a full 2 minutes engine off and did not make a sound. He would tell someone about it later, not in a boastful way, but in the quiet way people describe things that affected them unexpectedly. He said she looked like a person who had spent everything they had and was now completely empty in the way that only happens after something genuinely hard. He said he didn't feel right about disturbing that. Eventually, he said her name softly twice, and she woke up the way soldiers and operators wake up in the field, which is completely and immediately. No groggy middle passage between sleep and full awareness. Her hand moved toward the rifle case before her eyes were fully open. Then she registered where she was, took one breath, and was back. "We're at the Phobie," the driver said. "How long was I out?" "About 2 hours." Emma nodded. She got out of the vehicle, retrieved her gear, and walked toward the operations building. Her body ached in the specific way that comes from sustained prone position on hard rock. A deep muscular fatigue that ibuprofen helps with marginally and time fixes completely. She was hungry. She was thirsty. She was aware of both things in an abstract, deferred way, the way the body notes its own needs and files them for later when the priority list has room. what she was not. And this was the thing that would stay with her longest when she thought back on this day was shaken. She had expected to feel something like aftermath when it was over. Some version of the emotional unwinding she had heard other shooters describe the way the compressed intensity of a live operation decompresses afterward and can leave you feeling undone. What she felt instead was something more like settled, like a math problem correctly solved. The answer was what it was, and it was correct, and there was a quietness to correct answers that was its own kind of peace. She did not know yet what was waiting for her inside the operations building. Walker was standing in the main room when she came through the door. He had arrived 40 minutes earlier by helicopter with the rest of the assault team and Michael Dawson. He had already done the initial extraction debrief with the FOB commander, had already seen Dawson handed off to the medical team, had already done the immediate after-action communication that a successful hostage recovery required. He had done all of that, and then he had walked back to the main operations room and stood there waiting, because there was one thing he had not done yet. He had not spoken to Emma Carter. When she came through the door, Walker looked at her for a moment without saying anything. He was a man who chose his words with the precision he applied to everything else, and he was choosing them now. Emma read something in his face that she didn't have an immediate name for. It was not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. It was not professional satisfaction, though. That was part of it too. It was something more personal than either of those things. It was the look of a man who had trusted his own judgment under maximum pressure and had that trust confirmed in the most complete way possible. "Sit down," he said. Emma sat. Walker pulled a chair across from her and sat too, which was not the posture of a lieutenant conducting a debrief. It was the posture of a man having a conversation. "How are you?" he said. She looked at him. The question was real. He wanted a real answer. "Tired," she said. "Hungry. Otherwise okay. You sleeping in the vehicle wasn't a concern. You earned it." "I know," she said simply. Walker leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor for a moment before he looked back at her. "I want to tell you something before the formal debrief starts. Before the official version of today gets written and filed and becomes what people refer to when they talk about this operation." Emma waited. "I trusted you this morning when most of my team didn't," Walker said. "I want you to know I understood what I was doing when I made that call. It wasn't blind faith. I had read your file. I understood the numbers. But understanding numbers and then acting on them in a live environment with 12 men and a hostage on the line are two different things." He paused. "I want you to know that the decision to trust you fully, to move the overwatch position, to take the tertiary route based on your read, to give you the call on the aircraft, none of those were easy decisions. They were right, but they weren't easy." "I know they weren't," Emma said. "What I'm trying to say," Walker said, "is that your performance today was extraordinary by any standard I know how to apply. And I have applied a lot of standards over a lot of years to a lot of people." He paused again. "Your father would be proud." Emma was very still for a moment. The kind of stillness that isn't absence of emotion, but is the management of emotion by someone who has learned to manage it well. "How do you know about my father?" she said. Walker said, "Because when I couldn't figure out how a 19-year-old with a bolt gun ended up temporarily attached to my team through channels that bypassed every normal process, I asked the right question to the right person. And the right person told me that your father spent the last 8 years of his life consulting for the Naval Special Warfare Training Pipeline, specifically in long-range precision shooting doctrine, specifically under a classified arrangement that meant his name never appeared on any document." He watched her face. He was not a civilian who happened to know some military instructors. He helped train the men who train the snipers in this command. And he spent years quietly making the case to the right people that his daughter was better than any of them. Emma looked down at her hands. She looked at them for a long time. "He never told me," she said. "He wouldn't have," Walker said, "because telling you would have changed what he was building in you. He wanted you to know your capability from the inside, not from someone else's endorsement." The room was quiet for a moment. Somewhere else in the building, she could hear voices, activity, the ordinary sounds of a functional military facility doing its work. Out here in this corner of the main room, there was just the two of them and the weight of what Walker had just put on the table. Emma said, "Is that why I was assigned here, because of him?" "You were assigned here," Walker said, "because 3 people in this command who knew your father's work, who had been trained by instructors, He trained, reviewed your shooting record, and agreed it was not possible that a record like that belonged to someone who couldn't perform in an operational environment. You were assigned here because someone believed based on evidence that you were ready. He paused. They were right. Emma did not say anything for a moment. She was processing something that was clearly large and was clearly changing the shape of things inside her. The way understanding always changes the shape of things once it arrives. Her father had been present in her work in ways she hadn't fully known. The foundation he had laid was deeper than she had understood. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. Walker nodded. He stood, which signaled the personal part of the conversation was complete, and the professional part was about to resume. "The formal debrief starts in 40 minutes. Medical wants to look at you first. And there's food in the back room." "Sir," Emma said before he could walk away. "How is Dawson?" Walker stopped. "He's okay. Dehydrated. Some bruising. Scared out of his mind for 11 days, which takes a while to work through. But he's alive and he's going home." He looked at her. "Because of today. Because of you." He walked toward the debrief room. Emma sat for another minute in the empty chair in the main operations room and felt the full weight of that land. Because of you. She thought about Michael Dawson in that compound. 11 days. She thought about what 11 days in a place like that does to a person, the way hope and despair cycle through you in a rhythm that gradually erodes the boundary between them until you can't tell if what you're feeling is one or the other. She thought about the moment he heard the gunfire start and what he had believed in that moment. She thought about being carried out of that building by men who had come through an impossible approach because an overwatch position that everyone had doubted held the line. She thought about her father. She pulled the worn notebook from her chest pocket. She opened it to the last page, the one her father had filled in the final months of his life, when the handwriting was smaller and slightly less precise than the pages before it, but the content was as exact as it had ever been. She read the last entry he had made. It was not a ballistic table. It was not a wind calculation. It was 4 lines written in the margin of a page that had a range solution on it for a distance of 200 to 800 meters. He had written, "The distance is never the problem. The distance is just the test. What matters is everything you put between yourself and it. Build enough of that and no distance wins." Emma closed the notebook. She put it back in her pocket, close against her chest, and she went to find food. She was going to need her strength for what was still to come. The formal debrief lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes. It was conducted in a secure room with a naval intelligence representative present via secure video link, a JAG officer who said almost nothing but wrote everything down, DeFoe, Commander Walker, and the full assault team. Emma sat at the far end of the table with her notebook open and answered every question put to her in the flat, precise language of operational reporting, giving times, distances, observed behaviors, and the reasoning behind each engagement decision with the systematic clarity of someone who had not only done these things, but had understood why she was doing them at every moment she was doing them. The naval intelligence representative stopped her twice, both times to ask her to repeat something. Both times he asked the same follow-up question in different words. "How did you identify that?" Both times Emma answered the same way. Not in terms of training or technique or equipment. She answered in terms of what the thing she was observing was doing relative to what it should have been doing, the gap between expected behavior and actual behavior and how wide that gap was. She described it as a kind of listening, not to sound, to pattern. The second time she answered that way, Mason Reed, sitting 3 chairs down from her, made a very small sound that might have been a short exhale and might have been a word and might have been nothing. But she noticed it. And when she glanced at him briefly, he was looking at the table in front of him with an expression she recognized because she had seen it on other people's faces at other times in her life. It was the expression of someone doing private accounting, adding up what they got wrong and what that cost them and what they would do differently, and whether differently was even available to them at this point, or whether the moment had passed. She looked away and kept answering the intelligence representative's question. At 1842 hours, the debrief concluded. The FOB commander closed his notebook, thanked the team, and told them transport back to Coronado would be arranged for the following morning. The JAG officer collected his notes. The secure video link closed. People began moving toward the door. Mason Reed did not move toward the door. He sat at the table after everyone else had begun to file out, And Emma noticed this because she was also still at the table finishing a note she was making in her own records. She became aware with a peripheral attention that had been her constant companion all day that he was sitting there deliberately, that he was waiting. She finished her note, she capped her pen, she looked up. Mason was looking directly at her. He had the look of a man who has prepared what he is going to say and is now finding that the preparation was insufficient, that the words he had arranged in his mind while sitting there looked different now that the moment to say them has arrived. He said, "Carter." "Chief," she said. I was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable quiet. The quiet of someone measuring the distance between where they are and where they need to get to and calculating the most direct route. "The aircraft," he said, "the lead helicopter in the canyon turn. That was approximately 2,200 meters. Moving target, banking turn, thermal correction." He paused. "I have been shooting at this level for 16 years. I would not have taken that shot." Emma said nothing. She was listening. "I would have assessed it as outside the probability window," Mason said. "I would have called it a misrisk and found another solution. And if there was no other solution, I would have told Walker we needed a different plan." He paused again. "You took it and you made it. And Michael Dawson is alive tonight because you made it." "The team is alive tonight," Emma said. "Yes," Mason said. "The team too." He looked at the table for a moment and then back at her. "I laughed at your rifle this morning." "I know," Emma said. "I did it in front of everyone." "I know that too. I would like to tell you that I did it because I had legitimate concerns about platform capability in a live operational environment," Mason said. "But that would not be entirely honest. I did it because you are 19 years old and you walked in here with a bolt gun your father left you, and everything about that situation did not match what I have decided a serious shooter looks like." He said it plainly, without the defensive hedging that people use when they are confessing something, but don't want to fully own it. He owned it. "I judged what I saw. I didn't look past it." Emma looked at him for a moment. She thought about the briefing room that morning, which felt like it had happened in a different week. The sound of laughter bouncing off the walls, the weight of that rifle in his hands, the way he had held it up like a prop in his own performance. She thought about standing perfectly still and saying nothing and choosing to let the work speak instead of her voice. She said, "My father told me something when I was about 12 years old. He said the people who doubt you the loudest are often the people who will trust you the most completely once you show them something real." He said the loudness of the doubt was sometimes a measure of how seriously they took the question. Mason looked at her. "He wasn't always right about everything," Emma said, "but he was right about that." Mason was quiet for several seconds. And then he said something she did not expect, not because it was surprising in content, but because of the weight behind it, the weight of a man who does not make this kind of statement casually or often. "Your father trained some of my instructors," he said. "I know that now," Walker told the senior team members before the debrief. He paused. "I may have trained with people he taught, learned techniques that came from him without knowing they came from him." He looked at her steadily. "Which means I may have been laughing at my own teacher's rifle this morning." The room was very quiet. Emma felt something move through her that she didn't try to name. It was too complex and too personal for a single name. It was grief and pride and something that felt almost like her father was in the room, sitting very quietly in the back, watching this particular moment, the way he used to watch her on the range when she didn't know he was there yet, before she'd see him, and he'd just nod once to tell her everything was right. She said he would have found that funny. Mason looked at her, and then for the second time that day, a smile moved across his face. Not the broad, careless laughter of the briefing room. Something much smaller and much more real than that. "Yeah," he said, "I think he would have." He stood. He picked up his notes. He walked to the door and then stopped and turned around once more. "Carter," he said, "Chief, for what it's worth, I will never look at a shooter the same way again before I've seen them shoot." He paused. "That's a lesson I should have already known. I know it completely now." He left. Emma sat alone at the brief table for a moment in the quiet that he'd left behind him. She thought about what he had just said, and she thought about what it cost him to say it. Men like Mason Reed did not apologize easily. They did not revise their assessments of people easily. The pride of an expert is a real thing built over real years of real work, and dismantling even a part of it voluntarily is not a small act. She understood that. She did not think less of him for having been wrong. She She thought more of him for having come back to the table after. She stood up. She gathered her materials. She walked out of the debrief room and down the corridor towards the quarters that had been assigned to her for the night. She was in the corridor when Torres caught up with her. Torres was 23 years old and had been in the teams long enough to have lost the most obvious forms of naivety, but not long enough to have replaced them with the armor of false certainty that older operators sometimes grew. Up to her with the specific energy of someone who has been trying to figure out what to say and has decided that whatever comes out will be good enough. "Hey," he said. Emma looked at him. "Hey, I just wanted to say something," Torres said, "about last night when I asked if you were nervous. I remember. You said you were nervous about the things you hadn't anticipated yet," Torres said. "The unknown unknowns." He paused. "I've been thinking about that all day, between the shooting and the aircraft and all of it that's been sitting in the back of my head. Because you said you were nervous about what you might be missing, and then all day long, you kept finding the things you didn't know you were missing, before they became problems." Emma looked at him. She wasn't sure where he was going with this. "I guess what I'm saying is," Torres said, "how did you know to be nervous about that specific thing? How did you know that was the right thing to worry about?" Emma thought about it. "Because my father told me that confidence is how you feel about what you know," she said. "And worry is how you feel about what you don't. The only dangerous person on a ridgeline is the one who isn't worried about anything. That person has confused their preparation for total coverage of the problem. And total coverage is never available." She looked at Torres. "Being worried about what you haven't seen yet keeps you looking. And as long as you're still looking, you've still got a chance to find it before it finds you." Torres stood there processing that for a moment. "That's not something they teach in any course I've taken," he said. "No," Emma said. "It's not in any course." She said goodnight and kept walking. She reached her quarters and sat on the edge of the bunk and took her boots off and set them beside the door in the correct sequence that her training required. And then she sat there in the quiet for a moment. The day was settling around her now, the way the full weight of a hard day sometimes waits until you are finally still before it lands completely. She felt the weight of it, every shot, every calculation, every second of decision. Every moment when the gap between what she knew and what she needed to know was a breath wide, and she had reached across it by building on everything her father had put in her. She reached into her chest pocket and took out the notebook. She opened it to the last page with her father's handwriting on it. She read the 4 lines again. "The distance is never the problem. The distance is just the test." She turned to the next page, which was blank. She picked up the pen she had used in the debrief. She wrote 1 line in her own handwriting below the last thing her father had written. She wrote it small in the same margin where he had written his so that the 2 lines occupied the same page. She wrote, "Today the test was real. The distance didn't win." She closed the notebook. She lay back on the bunk. She looked at the ceiling for approximately 45 seconds. Then she was asleep. She did not dream, or if she did, the dreams were quiet ones that left no mark. At 06:12 the following morning, the transport to Coronado was being arranged and the team was assembling in the main operations room with their gear. Walker was reviewing the final documentation with the phobie commander. Mason was running equipment checks. Torres was drinking coffee and staring at nothing in particular with the look of someone who had slept badly and was making peace with it. Emma came in carrying her gear bag and her rifle case and set them near the door. She poured coffee. She stood with it and did not talk to anyone immediately, and no one came to talk to her, but the quality of that not talking was completely different from the previous morning. The previous morning, the space around her had been the space of exclusion. Someone who didn't belong. Someone who had not earned inclusion in a closed community of people who measured belonging by shared experience and demonstrated capability. This morning, the space around her was the space of respect. No one was making a point of respecting her. There was no performance of inclusion, no forced friendliness, no conscious effort to signal that things were different now. It was simpler and more fundamental than any of that. She was standing in a room of men who had been in a hard place and come out the other side, and she had been there with them, doing the things she had been sent to do, and they all knew it, and she knew it, and that knowing was the entire basis of the new arrangement. No further negotiation was required. Mason came over to get more coffee. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking, the way 2 people stand together when they have said what needed to be said and what remains is simply proximity. He said, "You get any sleep?" "Enough," she said. "You, well, some," he said. "Keep running the numbers on that helicopter shot." And, and I keep arriving at the same place," Mason said, "which is that I genuinely cannot account for how you put that round in a moving cockpit at 2,200 meters through a thermal layer with a bolt-action platform." He said it not with admiration in the performed sense, but with the specific, almost forensic interest of one craftsperson examining another's work and finding it technically inexplicable by their current framework. "I cannot reconstruct it with my own capability. I can't find the path through the variables." Emma drank her coffee. "I can walk you through the calculation if you want," she said. Mason looked at her. For a fraction of a second, she saw something flicker across his face that might have been the remnant of pride resisting the offer. Then it was gone. "Yeah," he said, "I do want that." "After we get back," she said. "After we get back," he agreed. Walker's voice from across the room. "Wheels up in 30 minutes. Get your gear to the vehicle." People started moving. The ordinary controlled activity of a team that has been through something and is now returning to the place they started from, carrying the experience already, in the process of becoming the next version of themselves that the experience has made possible. Emma picked up her rifle case and her gear bag and walked toward the vehicle. She was not thinking about what was behind her. She was not thinking about the shots, the aircraft, the canyon, the briefing room laughter, any of it. That was done. What she was thinking about was something much simpler. She was thinking about what her father would say when she told him. The habitual thought, the one that arrived before the grief, intercepted it and reminded her that there was no telling him that the conversation she kept instinctively reaching for was a conversation she would have to keep instead in the pages of that notebook in the margin below. The last thing he'd written in the lines she had added last night that he would never read. But he had given her everything she'd used today. Every calculation, every instinct, every refusal to be moved by the laughter in that briefing room, every decision to keep looking past the obvious thing toward the thing underneath it. He had spent her entire childhood handing her tools she would not need until she needed them completely, and she had needed them completely today, and they had held. That was his presence in the outcome. That was the conversation they were still having. She put her gear in the vehicle and got in, and the transport began moving toward the flight line, and the team rode in the quiet that comes after something serious has been resolved. No one needed to say anything. They all understood without the words who had carried the most weight when the weight had been impossible. The flight back to Coronado took 2 hours and 17 minutes. The team rode in a military transport, not the kind with rows of proper seats in overhead compartments, but the kind with canvas benches along the fuselage walls and gear stacked in the center and engine noise loud enough that conversation required deliberate effort. Most of the men didn't make that effort. They sat with their own thoughts in the specific silence of people who have been through something together that has not yet been fully processed and probably won't be for some time. Mason Reed sat across from Emma for most of the flight. He was not staring at her. He was looking at a point somewhere between the floor and the middle distance, doing the kind of internal accounting that men like him do after operations. The systematic review of every decision, every moment, everything that went right, and everything that could have gone wrong. Emma recognized it because it was something her father had taught her to do too. He called it walking backward through the day. You started at the end and worked toward the beginning, and at every step you asked what you had known and what you had assumed, and whether the difference between those two things had been visible to you at the time or only in retrospect. She did it herself for the first hour of the flight. She walked backward through everything, shot by shot, call by call, decision by decision. She found 2 places where she had been slower than optimal. One where she had held a second longer than the situation required before making a call to Walker. One where she had moved her scope past a position she should have held longer because her pattern had become predictable to herself. She noted both. She would carry them forward. Walker spent most of the flight on his satellite phone in the forward section of the aircraft, separated from the team by distance and the roar of the engines. Whatever conversations he was having were inaudible to everyone else, which was appropriate. Command conversations at that level in the immediate aftermath of an operation like this were not conversations for general distribution. Torres slept for about 40 minutes and then spent the rest of the flight staring at the ceiling in that specific way of someone who is not looking at the ceiling, but at something playing on the inside surface of their eyelids. Dawson was not on this transport. He had been redirected to a medical facility for evaluation before being cleared to travel. His family had been notified. He was going home, which was the thing that the entire operation had been built around achieving and which had been achieved. When the transport landed at North Island and the team began offloading gear, there was a brief moment on the tarmac that Emma would remember for the rest of her life, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of how ordinary it was. The 11 men of the assault team, as they passed her carrying their gear toward the vehicles, each acknowledged to her in some way, not with speeches or ceremony. Torres gave her a nod that carried more weight than most conversations. Two of the operators she had barely spoken to said her name as they passed, just her name, which in that context meant everything it needed to mean. One of them, an older operator named Briggs, who had said nothing to her since she arrived at Coronado the previous morning, stopped for a moment and looked at her and said, "Good work," and then kept walking. 2 words, completely sufficient. Mason was the last one off the transport. He came down the rear ramp carrying his own gear and hers, which she had not asked him to do, and which he had done without announcement. He set her rifle case and gear bag beside her on the tarmac, adjusted his own load, and kept walking toward the vehicles. He didn't look at her when he did it. It was not a performative gesture. It was simply what you did for someone who had carried the weight she had carried, the way that community expresses itself when it has accepted someone fully. Emma picked up her gear and followed the team. The formal after-action review at Naval Special Warfare Command happened 2 days after they returned to Coronado. It was a different category of review from the FOB debrief, where the FOB debrief had been about immediate operational facts times and positions and engagement decisions. The formal AAR was about the broader picture. What the operation revealed about enemy capability, about intelligence security, about the performance of the mission's various elements, and about what needed to change before the next time. Emma was present for the full review. She sat in the same briefing room where Mason had held up her rifle 2 mornings earlier. The same room, the same chairs, the same walls as it's in. The physical space was identical. Everything that occupied it was different. The review was conducted by the command's senior operations officer, a captain named Hargrove, who had the reputation of approaching after-action reviews the way a pathologist approaches an autopsy, which is to say with precise dispassion and a deep commitment to finding things that other people preferred not to find. He went through the operation chronologically, asking questions at specific points, working through each decision point with the assembled team. When he reached the Overwatch element, he paused. He looked at his notes for a moment. He looked up at Emma. He said, "Petty Officer Carter, the position change recommendation you made before insertion." "Yes, sir." "Walk me through the reasoning." Emma walked him through it. The canyon thermal pattern, the temperature differential, the solar angle, the drift effect, the comparison between the southern spur and the northern spur positions. She did it in approximately 4 minutes, concisely, without technical performance, the way she would explain a route to someone who needed to drive it. Hargrove listened. He did not write anything down while she was talking, which was unusual. He was the kind of man who wrote everything down. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The meteorological data that supported that recommendation was in the mission briefing package." "Yes, sir." "Was it flagged to the team during the briefing preparation phase?" A short pause in the room, because the answer to that question was no. It had been in the package. It had not been flagged. No one except Emma had cross-referenced the meteorological data with the specific geometry of the designated Overwatch position to identify the thermal drift consequence. It was data that was available to everyone and utilized by one person. Walker said, "It was not flagged, sir. The position change recommendation came from Petty Officer Carter the evening before insertion." Hargrove wrote something down. "The intelligence failure," he said, shifting forward in his notes, "the compromised approach routes, the prepared positions. Someone provided your operational details to the opposing force prior to insertion. That investigation is ongoing and outside the scope of this review. What I want to understand is the team's adaptive response when the compromise became apparent on the ground. I went through it piece by piece, the initial detection of the lookout, the identification of the ambush architecture, the route change, the canyon wall fighting positions, The underground force, the inbound aircraft, each decision point, each call, each engagement. At the aircraft engagement, he stopped again. He set his pen down. He looked at Emma for a long time, not a hostile look, the look of a man who is trying to fully absorb a data point that does not fit comfortably inside his existing framework. Petty Officer Carter, he said, the lead helicopter. You engaged a moving aerial target at 2,200 meters with a bolt-action platform through a developed thermal layer. Yes, sir. With one round. Yes, sir. Hargrove picked his pen back up. He wrote something. He put the pen down again. He said, I have been in this command for 11 years. I have reviewed more after-action reports than I can count. I have read engagement records from some of the finest precision shooters this country has produced. He paused. I do not know how to categorize what you did. The room was very quiet. I mean that technically, Hargrove said, not rhetorically. I genuinely do not have an existing framework that accounts for that shot under those conditions with that platform. I have sent the numbers to 3 separate ballistic analysis teams for independent review. All 3 came back with the same assessment. He looked at his notes. One of them described it as, and I am quoting directly, outside the boundaries of what our models predict as achievable for a human operator at that range with that equipment under those atmospheric conditions. He looked back at Emma. Their words, not mine. Emma said nothing. She was not sure what the appropriate response was to being told you had done something that the model said you couldn't do. She settled for sitting still and letting the statement exist in the room without qualification. Mason Reed, 2 seats to her left, was looking at the table. His jaw was set in a particular way that Emma had learned to read over the past 2 days as the external sign of significant internal processing. Hargrove moved on. He completed the review. He made several recommendations about intelligence security protocols, about the pre-mission vetting of designated positions against meteorological data, about force estimation for complex terrain operations. He was thorough and unsparing and clearly very good at his job. At the conclusion, he stood. The room stood with him. He looked at Walker. Outstanding adaptive leadership under a compromised operation lieutenant. He looked at the team broadly, exceptional execution under conditions that exceeded the planned parameters by a significant margin. He looked at Emma last. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said something that was not in the formal language of military commendation. Something simpler than that. Your father would be very proud, he said, and then he gathered his notes and walked out before she could respond. Emma stood in the room after he left and felt the specific, complex weight of a statement she had now heard twice in 2 days from 2 people who had known things about her father that she had not fully known herself. She had spent 3 years grieving a man she thought she understood completely. She was discovering that she had understood him only in the dimension she could see the father dimension, the man who drove her to ranges and corrected her position and wrote in the small notebook and told her things about distance and patience and knowing what was between you and the target. She had not known the other dimension, the professional one. The man who had walked through this world doing serious work that serious people took seriously and had left behind him a legacy that had shaped people who now sat in the same rooms as her and said his name with a weight she was only beginning to fully understand. She was still learning him, from the outside in which was the only direction still available to her. Walker found her in the armory 30 minutes after the formal review concluded. She was cleaning her rifle, which she did after every use regardless of circumstance, a habit so deep it was pre-conscious. The armory was mostly empty at that hour. 2 other operators working on equipment at the far end, otherwise just her and the familiar smell of solvent and metal and the particular quiet that armories have. Walker came in, saw what she was doing, and pulled a stool from beside a nearby workbench. He sat. He waited until she had finished the section she was on before he spoke. I have some information I need to share with you, he said. Emma looked up. The intelligence investigation into the operational compromise has produced an initial finding, Walker said. The team's approach routes and timing were leaked from a planning document that was accessed by an unauthorized party approximately 72 hours before insertion. The investigation is still ongoing as to the specific source. He paused. What that means operationally is that every standard approach route, every fallback position, every extraction corridor we would have used under normal conditions was known to the opposing force in advance. The entire ambush architecture was built on that specific intelligence. Emma set down the cleaning cloth. They knew we were coming before we left, she said. Yes, and they knew how we were going to come. Every conventional method. Yes. Emma was quiet for a moment. The northern spur overwatch position, she said, was not in the planning document, Walker said, because it wasn't the designated position. It was a late change, recommended by an attachment whose presence wasn't finalized in the planning document that was accessed. The opposing force planned for a southern spur overwatch at 2,700 meters with a modern precision platform, not a northern spur position at 2,900 meters with a bolt gun. He paused. They had a counter-sniper element designated to neutralize our overwatch at the southern spur position. That element was in place before we inserted. If we had used the original position, our overwatch would have been eliminated in the first minutes of the operation. The weight of that settled over Emma, like something physical. The position change she had recommended, the one based on thermal analysis, the one that had been dismissed as overthinking, the one that Mason had pushed back on and that Walker had approved, had not just improved the ballistic conditions for her shooting. It had removed her from the location where the enemy had positioned a counter-sniper specifically to kill her. She had survived because she had moved. She had moved because of the thermals. She had identified the thermals because she had spent 6 hours studying everything between herself and the target, rather than the target itself. Her father's lesson. Great shooters never stare at the target. They master everything between themselves and it. He had given her that lesson. That lesson had kept her alive. Her throat was very tight for a moment. She managed it the way she managed everything, with stillness and breath, in the discipline of a person who has learned that control is not the suppression of feeling, but the decision about when feeling belongs. Walker watched her process it. He didn't rush her. After a moment, she said, "Did anyone else know that when we were on the ground?" "No," Walker said. "We found out during the investigation, 48 hours after the operation." "Does Mason know?" "He will. I'm telling team members individually. You're first." Emma looked at her rifle on the cleaning mat. She thought about the southern spur. She thought about whoever had been waiting there in a counter-sniper hide with a modern precision platform and confirmed intelligence on her position, expecting her to show up and not knowing she had gone somewhere else. Because a 19-year-old had read the wind and done the math, and a lieutenant had trusted her. Oz said, "Who made the call to trust the position change?" "You know who made it," Walker said. "I know. I want to hear you say it." "I made it," Walker said. "Based on what?" "Based on the numbers in your file," Walker said. "And based on the fact that you were right about the physics, and based on something harder to articulate than either of those things, which is that when you explained the thermal pattern to me, you weren't performing confidence. You were reporting an observation, and people who are reporting observations and people who are performing confidence sound completely different, even when they're saying the same words." He looked at her steadily. "I've been making that distinction for 14 years. I have rarely been more certain of it than I was that evening." Emma said, "Thank you for making the call." "Thank you for giving me something solid to make it on," Walker said. He stood, replaced the stool where he had found it, and walked toward the armory door. He stopped once and turned back. "The formal commendation process is going to take some time. The circumstances are complicated, classification levels and so on. But I want you to know that what goes into that record will accurately reflect what happened on that ridge." He paused. "Every shot, every call, every minute of it." He left. Emma sat alone with her rifle and the information Walker had given her, and the particular interior landscape that information created. She finished cleaning the rifle. She did it slowly, completely, the way her father had taught her, which was that the care you take of a tool is the care you take of your own capability. When she was finished, she opened the hard case and laid the rifle in it and latched it closed. She sat for a moment with her hand on the case. Then she took out this notebook. She turned to the page with her father's last 4 lines and the single line she had added in the dark at the fob 2 nights ago. She looked at both for a long time. Then she turned to the next blank page. She wrote, "I moved because of the wind. The wind saved my life. You told me to watch the wind. You told me that everything between me and the target mattered. You were right about more than the ballistics. You were right about everything." She closed the notebook. She put it in her chest pocket. She picked up the rifle case and walked out of the armory. Mason Reed was in the corridor. I was not waiting for her in the way he had waited in the debrief room the previous day, deliberately and with prepared words. He was simply there coming from the direction of the equipment room, and they arrived at the same point in the corridor at the same time, and there was a moment where both of them recognized that this was going to be another conversation. Mason looked at her. He looked at the rifle case. He said, "Walker told me." Emma waited. "About the counter-sniper position at the southern spur," Mason said. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it that was neither level nor comfortable. "About what would have happened if you'd been in the position we originally designated." "Yes," Emma said. Mason looked at the rifle case in her hand for a long moment. "I pushed back on that position change," he said. "I told Walker you were overthinking it." "I know. If Walker had listened to me instead of you, you'd be dead," Mason said. He said it plainly without dramatizing it and without minimizing it because it was a fact and it required neither decoration nor softening. And without Overwatch, we would have walked into the southern spur ambush position without our eyes. And without eyes at that range, the operation doesn't look the way it looked. Maybe we don't come back. Maybe Dawson doesn't come back. He paused. "I need you to understand that I know that, not in the abstract. I know it specifically." Emma looked at him. "I know you know it," she said. "I could tell in the armory during the AAR." Mason was quiet for a moment. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out and took the rifle case from her hand. He held it the way the young petty officer driver had held it 2 days ago, at the Fubi, like it was something valuable that deserved care. He looked at it for a moment. "I held this up in front of 14 people and called it a kid's gun," he said. "You did," Emma said. "It is the finest piece of equipment that has been in this building in 16 years, Mason said. "Not because of what it is, because of what you've done with it." He handed it back to her with both hands the way you hand something back to its owner when you understand what it means to them. "I judged the rifle, then I judged the shooter. I was wrong about both." Emma took the rifle case from him with both hands. She held his gaze for a moment. "My father chose this rifle because it required him to be better than the equipment," she said. "He said modern systems compensate for shooter weakness. He didn't want compensation. He wanted to know exactly what he was capable of." She paused. "He gave it to me for the same reason." Mason looked at her for a long time. Something moved across his face that was too layered to name simply. It was the look of a man revising a fundamental belief about how expertise announces itself and finding that the revision is uncomfortable and necessary and ultimately clarifying all at once. "How old were you when he started teaching you?" Mason said. 7, Emma said. "What did he teach you first?" "How to breathe," she said. "He said everything else depended on that." Mason was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been shooting for 22 years. Nobody told me it started with breathing until my 4th year." He said most people start in the wrong place, Emma said. They start with the equipment or the technique. He always said the equipment and the technique are just the outside of the problem. You have to start from the inside. Mason looked at her. And then he said the thing she least expected to hear from him in that corridor, or any other place that day, or possibly any day. "Would you teach me," he said, "what he taught you, the way he taught it?" The question landed in the corridor with a quietness that was almost physical. Emma looked at him and understood what the question actually cost him. A 16-year veteran, the finest shooter in the command by every record that had existed before this week, asking a 19-year-old to teach him something. The pride that required setting aside was not trivial. It was the kind of pride that men like Mason Reed had built their professional identities on. I was setting it aside completely and asking directly. She thought about what her father would say. She thought about what he had told her once about the difference between teachers and students. He had said, the best students are always the best teachers, and the best teachers are always still students. The day you stop being willing to learn from someone who knows something you don't, you stop getting better. And the day you stop getting better, you start getting worse. Mason Reed was offering to keep getting better, at the cost of his ego in the presence of someone he had dismissed 24 hours earlier. That it was not a small thing. "Yes," Emma said, "I'll teach you what he taught me." Mason nodded. The nod was not casual. It was the nod of a man making a commitment, the precise, deliberate acknowledgement of an agreement that meant something. Good, he said. They stood in the corridor for a moment longer, and then the natural end of the exchange arrived, and they went their separate ways. Mason toward the operations section and Emma toward the administrative office, where she needed to complete her temporary attachment paperwork and begin the process of whatever came next. What came next turned out to be complicated and surprising in ways that took time to fully reveal themselves. The formal after-action documentation was completed over the following 2 weeks. The commendation package Walker had referenced was drafted, reviewed, revised for classification purposes, reviewed again, and eventually finalized in a form that accurately captured the operational facts without revealing details that required protection. Emma was not present for most of that process. She had returned to her home unit after the temporary attachment concluded, carrying with her the rifle, the notebook, and the specific internal change that happens to a person when they have been completely tested and have found that they are enough. But the story did not stay contained to the documentation. It moved the way true things move in closed communities. Not through official channels, not through anything that was said openly in briefings or written in reports. It moved through the conversations that happen in break rooms, in parking lots, and on the edges of ranges. When people who were there talked to people who weren't, and people who weren't talked to people further removed, and each conversation carries the essential shape of what happened even as the specific details adapt to the telling. What moved through the SEAL community in the weeks and months following the operation was not primarily the shots. The shots were extraordinary, and they were part of it. But what moved was something more fundamental than the shots. What moved was the story of the briefing room, of the laughter, of the rifle held up like a joke, of the silence that answered it, and of what happened in the canyon, in the sky above the canyon afterward, when the laughter ran out of ground to stand on and what was underneath it was revealed. Every community has its shared lessons. The lessons it returns to, the stories it tells itself about what actually matters and what only appears to matter, and the difference between those two things. The lesson that moved through the community in the wake of Emma Carter's 3 days at Coronado was not technical. It was not about ballistics or thermal correction or extended range shooting. It was about the assumption of mediocrity in the presence of unfamiliar excellence. About the way expertise sometimes arrives without announcement in the wrong package, carrying the wrong equipment, saying nothing in response to contempt, waiting instead for the only arena where the truth of a thing is ever fully decided. Mason Reed became the most consistent person in the community telling that story, not because he had been the target of it, but because he had been the source of the lesson. He told it without embellishing his own wrong and without softening it either. He told it exactly as it had happened, and he told it because he understood that the most useful thing a man can do with a mistake that cost him nearly everything is refuse to let it cost the people coming behind him the same price. I told it to young operators in training. He told it to senior enlisted who sometimes made the same error in different clothes. He told it to officers who needed to hear that the silence of a competent person in the face of dismissal is not weakness. It is the patience of someone who knows that the work will speak when the moment arrives and who does not feel the need to speak before the moment. He carried Emma's father's lesson without fully knowing he was carrying it. Walker went on to lead 3 more operations over the next 18 months, each shaped in some way by what he had learned about the specific sound of real confidence versus performed confidence, and about what it meant to trust an assessment built on observation rather than reputation. He never talked about the Canyon operation publicly, but in every operation that followed, there was a moment where he made a decision based on evidence rather than expectation. And in those moments, he was always aware in the private way of a man who keeps his own accounting that he had learned something irreplaceable from a 19-year-old sitting across from him with mission maps on a folding table and the specific calm of someone who had already done the math. Torres never forgot the conversation in the corridor the night before the transport home, the one about being nervous about the right things. He kept it the way young operators keep the things that reshape their understanding of what the job actually requires, and it showed up years later in how he trained the people who came after him. He taught them to be worried about what they hadn't seen yet. He taught them that worry properly directed is not the enemy of confidence. It is what keeps confidence honest. And Emma Carter went back to her unit and continued shooting and continued learning and continued filling the pages of the notebook in the margins of her father's entries, adding her own data points alongside his. The way a conversation continues between people who never stop having things to say to each other, regardless of the distance between them. 18 months after the Canyon operation, a formal recognition ceremony was held at Naval Special Warfare Command. It was not large or loud. Military ceremonies of genuine substance rarely are. Emma was present in her dress uniform with her father's notebook in her chest pocket, where it lived now as permanently as her own heartbeat. Hargrove, the senior operations officer who had told her he couldn't categorize her shots, presented the commendation. He read the citation in the flat, formal language that such documents require, and every person in that room heard the formal language and understood the real language beneath it simultaneously, the way fluent speakers of a language hear both what is said and what is meant. When it was over, Mason Reed came and stood beside her, which was where he had been standing figuratively since the corridor conversation with the rifle case, and which was where he would stand for the rest of the time. They both served in the specific way of a man who has been changed by someone and knows it and does not pretend otherwise. He said, "Your father built something that held under the hardest test I have ever seen." Emma said he would say it was just the distance, that the distance is never the problem. Mason said, "What would you say?" Emma looked across the room for a moment. She thought about the canyon, the thermals, the shots she should not have been able to make, the counter-sniper who had been waiting in the position she had vacated, the aircraft in the canyon turn, Michael Dawson's voice on the radio when Walker announced they had him, the notebook, the 4 lines, the 1 line she had added. She said, "I would say the distance is exactly the problem. And the answer to it is everything you put between yourself and it every day for years until the distance runs out of reasons to win." She said it the way her father had taught her to say things that mattered. Without decoration, without performance, as a fact that had been tested and confirmed and would not be revised. Mason Reed looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has heard something true and is marking the place where he heard it so he can return to it. He said, "Exactly right." And that was the whole of it. Real excellence does not announce itself. It does not argue for itself. It does not ask for rooms to quiet down or hands to be raised or laughter to stop. It simply arrives in whatever form the work requires, and it does the work. And when the work is done, no announcement is necessary. The canyon remembered. The notebook held the proof. And the rifle that made the men laugh carried every shot inside it, like a word in a sentence that had taken 19 years to finish. Writing the sentence her father had started. The first morning he put the stock against her small shoulder and told her to breathe, and that she had finished in the desert under a sky that asked the hardest possible question and received in return the only answer that had ever mattered. She was ready. She had always been ready. She had simply been waiting for the distance to be real.